Hi guys, Mr. Halp here, and as you can see, today's lesson is III.C, and the subject of discourse that we've got today is synthesizing sources, which, to some extent we've already started talking about. Obviously, this unit is on the subject of synthesis, and that's one of the main practices that we're expected to undertake with the AP Langen-Comp test. But what we haven't really talked about is what we mean by that. I mean, I know, for example, in a lot of situations I've mentioned how you need to weave sources together and whatnot. And while that's true, this isn't, of course, a weaving class. So what is it that we're actually doing when we're doing this weaving, this synthesizing of sources? Today is a chance to really start to get a little bit into that and hopefully walk away from this particular lesson with a better understanding of, okay, so that's what I actually need to do, okay? So without any further ado, let's dive into this. So synthesizing sources, what are we doing, okay? Well, whether we're writing an argumentative piece or not, we are constantly drawing on the ideas of others to develop our own informed position, to provide evidence, or to explore the counter-argument. And keep in mind what I said, that's whether we're writing rhetoric or not, whether we're reading rhetoric or not. It doesn't really matter, okay? Our lives are lived by looking at the ideas of others, seeing the evidence, exploring counter-arguments, and so on and so forth. And so really, this is just taking this practice that we're doing all the time and everywhere and channeling it a little bit more deliberately and concertedly right there into the texts that we're composing. So we come down and we have this definition of synthesis, which again, maybe we should have started with, but I think this is as good a place as any. So what is synthesis? Well, it's combining two or more ideas or sources to create something more complex in support of a new idea or argument. So that's what synthesis is. Synthesis is the combining of things. You're making one thing out of two things, or one thing out of three things, or one thing out of four things. That's the synthesis. That's how it works. So you're taking either ideas from other locations or specific sources, and you're uniting them together. There's that weaving that we've been talking about before in support of your own argument. And your argument might be a continuation of their argument from those ideas and those sources, but it also might be a sort of a different version of it, or a modified version, a qualified version of it. It also might be a completely different argument whatsoever, but it sort of piggybacks off of some of the ideas and the evidence that is provided in those other sources. That's what synthesis truly is. Within the scope of the AP Lang test, what you're going to get is you're going to get a prompt, a writing prompt, and you're going to get 7 approximately little sources, short pieces, articles, essays, some graphics usually, maybe an ad, maybe a chart or a graph, and you're going to say, okay, prove this prompt, your response to this prompt, using these 7 sources or so. So you can see how, okay, well, that's where we're combining multiple ideas or sources in order to support my own new argument, okay? Your textbook sort of describes this with this party analogy, which I think, is a good way to talk about this, okay? So let's go through this step by step. A party has 100 simultaneous conversations. So let's assume you're invited to a pretty big party, okay? I mean, maybe we can even think about it as a wedding. Weddings are usually a little bit larger than the average. At any given point in time, there are 100 simultaneous conversations going on. Okay, you arrive to that party and you approach one of those conversations. Doesn't matter which one, you just, find the first one that's available to you and you walk over and you start listening to that. But in order to actually start to involve yourself within that conversation of other people, you first have to listen to what the others have already said. Okay, you sort of need to get the track of where is this conversation coming from? Who is taking which perspective? Does this person believe that? Does that person believe that? What do you need to know about that? And what they're not saying, what you can contribute that hasn't already been said to that. Hopefully you're starting to see how this is sort of the whole concept of synthesis in sort of this extended metaphor of sorts, okay? Now, you've now got some good background on what's already been said and what is being said and where your peers are in the whole argumentation. Now you can start to challenge what they are saying, filling in the gaps of their understanding, contributing to the conversation yourself. This is synthesis. Synthesis is entering a conversation that society is having about a topic, except that the party is academia and the conversing speakers are reputable sources. And really, this is something, this party analogy does a great job of explaining it from the perspective of rhetoric, but this is something that English teachers, and hopefully you've experienced in other English classes, that you may have heard about before, called intertextuality. The fact that every time anybody writes, they're not really writing for the first time. They're adding their piece of the puzzle to this whole great big intertextual body of human work, okay? For example, if I wrote a novel tonight and I published that novel tomorrow, my novel is going to be influenced by the things that I've read in the past. And as a consequence of that, my novel that's published tomorrow will likely influence people who write novels the next day, and so on and so forth. That's kind of where this is all coming from. This party analogy is what we would call intertextuality. Texts are constantly commenting on and interacting with other texts, and they're building on top of other texts, and they're responding to other texts. And you're doing that very noticeably whenever you're doing synthesis. You have to go to whatever the topic of conversation is, take a good look around, see who's saying what the prevailing ideas are, what the evidence is, where there's a gap in that conversation, and take the stuff that's already in existence and use that to offer your own insight, to participate in the conversation in a way that brings something new to it and a new, fresh perspective, but also doesn't neglect all the stuff that happened before. And there you have it. That's synthesis. So that's what you need to be thinking about as we start to get into this a little bit more wholeheartedly, okay? Now, some things to consider as we further discuss this. Perspective and position are not synonymous. You're going to need to be sort of aware of the discrepancies between the two of those things. So you're going to be presenting a perspective and a position when you're writing rhetoric, particularly within the scope of this intertextual synthesis that you'd be creating. What is perspective? Well, that's the writer's view of a topic based on that writer's background, interests, or expertise. We all have our own individual background. My background is not going to be the same as yours, nor is it going to be the person who sits next to you in class. Just like our interests are different and our expertise is all different. And you could say that our expertise is different between me and the English teacher next door because, well, we all have things that we're better at than others, classes that I took that my neighbor didn't take, so on and so forth. So our perspectives are going to be very unique to us and very different, and that's going to change, alter, fluctuate the perspectives that each and every one of us bring to the table when we're participating in that party conversation, okay? Next, we come down to the position. Okay, so what's position? Well, this is a statement of the writer's perspective on a topic that articulates an arguable claim. So that perspective is sort of where I come from, and the position is articulating my opinion based on that perspective, okay? It's going to blend in with a claim in the thesis more concretely than just what that perspective would, because the perspective describes me more than it necessarily describes the claim that I'm making, okay? Writers may hold the same position on a topic, yet have very different perspectives on it. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And, you know, as with so many things in this class, think about it from a political perspective. Two people might espouse the same political party's beliefs, but nevertheless have two very different perspectives, backgrounds, interests, and expertise, informing why they espouse that political party's perspectives. Okay, so something to keep in mind in there. Reaching various perspectives can add range and complexity to your understanding, and that's something that you want to really start thinking about as we get into this. So you need to be prepared for the audience's perspectives as you're starting to present your argument to them. Meaning that if you can satisfy a whole different bunch of perspectives within the scope of one text, then that's going to widen the range of people that you affect. That's going to influence more people to agree with your cause because you've been sensitive to the perspective and the fact that there are different perspectives and the fact that your audience, which might have some similarities, nevertheless has also some subtle differences at the same time. And so you really want to be writing with an intention to appeal to as many perspectives as you can that are likely to pop up within the scope of your audience, okay? Synthesizing sources does not require dispute between positions. And that's an important thing that you want to keep in mind as well. We sort of have this notion in our heads that if we're writing rhetoric or if we're participating in anything persuasive, that there are, two parties that are butting heads against each other in every situation. That's not necessarily the case. When you're synthesizing sources, you're not necessarily trying to show a side that is right and a side that is wrong, or show the side that is wrong, would be your audience, the side that is right. That's not necessarily how this always manifests itself. In a lot of cases, it might be exactly what we're talking about here, merely just presenting the same position to a different perspective audience in the hopes of widening their understanding of the issue, okay? So, let's bring this down then. So in this idea of synthesis, as we've already mentioned before, we really need to be using sources to inform our argument. The question is, okay, how do we do that? I mean, yeah, you've probably written research papers before, but what are some of the specific methodologies that we can identify so that we can say, all right, if I need to sit down and put these sources in my paper, I have some frame of reference to say, I can do this, or I can do this, or I can do that, or I can do that with this source that I'm doing. And frankly, you've got a great tool here with this beam method, which we'll talk about in just a moment, that does exactly that, okay? So first thing, some background to discuss about this. The persuasiveness of your sources does not eliminate your contribution to the conversation. And that's an important thing you want to keep in mind. Just because you're using sources doesn't mean you don't have anything to say. Remember what we talked about from the very beginning. The party's been going on for thousands of years now. The party is all of human culture and civilization. You're contributing to it in the same way that your sources are contributing to it, by taking a look at what has already passed before them and adding their own ideas and information to the mix of things. So don't, if you come to the conclusion that, well, I'm using sources so I don't have anything to say, well, that would be just like your sources stopping writing, stopping producing their texts because they felt the same way that you felt. Remember, the conversation is ongoing. We've got this constant state of intertextuality that affects all of human existence, okay? You're going to use those sources, though, to demonstrate your own understanding and inform your own ideas. And that's what your sources are going to be doing for you, okay? So like it says, demonstrate your own understanding. I've talked about before how I got a lot of, especially lower level students who do quote dumping. They get sources and they pull information out of it and they shove it in their essay, but they don't do anything with it. Well, those people aren't really demonstrating their understanding of the topic, okay? They're not using it in a way that shows me that they understand what they're talking about. And as a consequence, I'm less likely to believe any original ideas that they do present, okay? As the second half of that sentence says then, it's also going to inform your own ideas. You're going to take those ideas from those sources and you're going to build on them. You're going to add to them. You're going to combine them. Synthesis, remember. And you're going to make something new and unique based on those pre-existing ideas, which nobody is expected to come up with all original ideas on their own. They're supposed to make those original ideas off of those foundations that human society has created, okay? So keep in mind, though, that sources enhance, they don't replace, an argument. Your argument is yours and yours alone. If your sources are your argument, then really someone else is doing all the arguing for you. So you need to make sure that you come up with the argument on your own, and then those sources help to support it, help to add evidence to it. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, we've got this beam method, which is a great way to think about, am I using sources as variably and fully as I possibly can? So the beam method ensures you're strategically using sources to support an argument instead of merely quoting from them. Again, that's what quote dumping would be. Okay. So if you're using sources correctly, you might be using that source for background. That's the B in beam, of course. A writer can use a source to provide an audience with background or context about a given topic, position, or perspective. So if there's facts, there's information, there's some kind of context that the audience needs to be familiar with, aka some kind of background, those sources are a great source to provide that information to your audience. So you should be using sources to create that background, that context, okay? The E in BEAM, of course, would be exhibit. A source can act as an exhibit or as an evidence to support a writer's argument. This is obviously probably the biggest one, probably the one that you're most likely to think of in the context of writing a synthesis essay. The fact that you need evidence. The sources are going to supply the evidence. Again, not any one person can provide all of the evidence and locate all of the evidence. Sometimes we need to use other sources to see what other evidence has already been gathered. Again, we're contributing to the conversation that has pre-existed us and that will extend well after us. Third would then be argument. A writer can join the conversation on a topic by refuting, rebutting, conceding, refining, affirming, or extending the argument in a source. Lots of different ing verbs we got going on in that case, but that shows you a lot of important stuff. So what do the opinionated individuals participating in this conversation already believe? Where is it right? Where is it wrong? What does it do well? What does it do poorly? What can you refute, rebut, and concede from the other authors who are contributing to that small window of conversation that you're adding to when you write your particular text? So you might use evidence to support the argument that you're making about those other people's opinions, but it's important if you're going to have your own opinion to make sure that you are saying, well, where your argument fits into the context of all of those other people's opinions who are also participating in the argument, okay? And then, of course, method is that last one. That's our M in BEAM. The logic, conclusions, or methods of a source can be applied to the writer's own issue or argument. So what conclusions have they reached? What scientific experiments have they done? What methods did they use to undertake such experiments? And you can use that as the basis for saying, okay, well, in a similar context, if we did a similar thing, we might get a similar outcome. Okay, so taking specifically a look at what methods were used to glean this information, to get these ideas, to uncover or logically deduce, whatever the case may be, the conclusions that these other sources have presented within the scope of their text. So, to reiterate, whenever you're using sources, chances are you're either going to pull background information from those sources, exhibits, aka evidence from those sources, the arguments that other people have from those sources, or the methodology that they use to glean their own information from the universe, okay? And as I mentioned to you, I finally define it for you right here and right now. Be wary of the quote dumping. And that's what BEAM is hopefully going to discourage you from ever doing. If you're doing BEAM properly, you don't need to worry about quote dumping, because when you dump a quote into your essay without offering commentary, and that's the key component of this, in the hopes that it will do all the heavy lifting for you, what ends up happening is it doesn't do any lifting. It just sort of sits there as dead weight. It doesn't provide any insight into your argument. It doesn't make you look like you know what you're talking about. And as a consequence of that, we just, as the reader, see that evidence and think to ourselves, okay, but what do we do with this? Because remember, it just sort of sits there. It's dumped there and left on our laps with no real function or purpose, okay? So that's why if you're specifically saying, okay, I'm going to use this quote and I'm going to use it as background or as an exhibit or as an argument or as methodology, well, okay, then you're less likely to be dumping it there, because by its very nature, by its very function, you're going to have to provide the commentary that is necessary to make sure that it accomplishes its end goal. So that's a little bit about synthesizing sources as we move further into this particular unit. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class. But as you can imagine, this is kind of a big topic that governs a lot of what we're going to do as we experiment more and more and more with the synthesis style of writing, preparing for the AP Lang exam. So I hope that made some sense to you, and I will see you again shortly, guys.